Serious people who grew up in a small town. What is that incident everyone knows about, but no one talks about? Story 1. Attention. Serious tag notice jokes, puns, and off-topic comments are not permitted in any comment, parent or child. Parent comments that aren't from the target group will be removed, along with their child replies. Report comments that violate these rules. Posts that have few relevant answers within the first hour, and posts that are not appropriate for the serious tag will be removed. Consider doing an AMA request instead. Thanks for your cooperation and enjoy the discussion. I am a bot, and this action was performed automatically. Please contact the moderators of this subreddit message compose. AskReddit if you have any questions or concerns. Story 2. Wife of sheriff's deputy was cheating on him with a guy. Guy ends up dead of a shotgun shot to the head. Sheriff's deputy is somehow first on scene. Sheriff's department rules it a suicide. Shotgun that guy supposedly shot himself with was never found. Story 3. This took place in Wayne, Nebraska in the 80s. After graduating, 2 football jocks beat the suspected gay kid and broke both of his legs. They run banks there now. Everyone knows they did it. They were never arrested. Story 4L. I came here ready and willing to share my story of insurance fraud about that one house that was for sale for nearly 2 decades before it mysteriously caught fire. But I see that's really small potatoes compared to everyone else. Story 5. There was a girl and her beau who went for a night on the town. They were seen arguing with a man at the end of the night. The next morning the guy was found dead from gunshots in one location. The girl was found a couple days later in another location. No one was ever arrested and the main suspect was her married chief of police ex. 40 years later, they dug the fella up to try and run some tests as part of a cold case investigation. When they opened his casket, his head had been removed and replaced with someone else's head. We in the town don't talk about it much, but that show The Dead Files did an episode about it. Story 6. Teacher grooms and rapes teenager at high school. Gets caught by off-duty cop who is suspicious a young woman who is obviously not his wife or daughter is going into teacher's house. Cop and teacher where neighbor's guy gets tried. Goes to jail. Girl gets huge settlement from school district like $3-5 million thereabouts. Teacher gets out of jail. Teacher now lives in nice lakeside house, with aforementioned student he groomed, courtesy of the payout of his former employer. What a fantastically happy ending. Story 7. The high school history teacher who exposed himself in the park and was arrested, was on leave for 6 months and then came back and taught like nothing happened. For senior slideshow, students put up a picture of him and played the police song Don't Stand So Close to Me. Story 8. Respected military veteran and firefighter with wife and 3 kids died of COVID-19. Anyone knows he actually died overdosing on pain pills prescribed legitimately to his wife, while drinking, in full view of the kids. It wasn't a deliberate suicide attempt, it was a manipulative bid for pity after his wife caught him cheating with a teenager and told him that same night she'd be taking the kids and filing for divorce. Apparently the manner in which she caught them cheating was also some sort of highly irregular act, on top of it all. Story 9. The elderly couple suicide pact where the husband drugs and asphyxiates his wife while watching sunset in the local state park, but loses his nerve when it's his turn to go, is pulled over by a park ranger for erratic driving, going back home 5 miles away, wife still unbuckled in the front seat. Story 10. It didn't happen to me, but a buddy of mine grew up in a small farming community in rural Montana. This all happened about 15 years ago. There was a guy in his neighborhood who was known as a real friendly guy who would wave to people while sitting on his porch. He would hand out the big-size candy bars to trick-or-treaters on Halloween. Just a friendly old man. He had to have been in his late 80s early 90s. Nothing seemed off about him. From the way my friend tells it, one day out of nowhere a bunch of police cars including an FBI van pull up to this old man's house. My friend told me they went inside and a few minutes later this harmless old man is being taken away in handcuffs. It drew a pretty big crowd because remember this is a small farming community in Montana, news travels fast. It turns out this old man everyone loved had a really dark secret in the 1960s. He was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and not just any Klan group but the infamous Mississippi White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and he was connected to over a dozen unsolved murders of civil rights activists. It shocked everyone, and no one has really spoken of it since. Story 11. There was a very brutal murder of a special needs young woman here. Her boyfriend's family took her in and held her captive for her SS checks. After she gave birth, she wasn't allowed to hold her daughter. They then tortured her for months in the worst ways possible, making her eat feces, macing her eyes, tying her up in a closet. They killed her by stabbing her and pushing her onto a railroad track. It barely got any news coverage. Story 12. My junior high school science teacher from over 25 years ago was involved with a student in my mother's class 20 years earlier, while this girl was still very much underage, then married her. Before he came out as gay and split from her, he was still a teacher until he retired sometime in the mid-aughts. Everyone knew about it. My mother said the other girls were jealous because they all thought he was cute and nice. If I remember correctly, he wasn't the only teacher of that era at my school who married a student either, and while I was still there I found out this. Later there was a young married teacher who was having with a student in the school. He's still a teacher, as they were never caught. Story 13. This is a series of incidents everyone knows about in my hometown, and everyone does talk about, but it's just too good not to share. Background first. This is a story about a small Australian coastal town called Wingham. It has between 1 or 2 pubs on average. That's a whole other story. At the time of this story it was 2. It also hosts an annual rodeo and a local football team, so when the rodeo is in town, all the cowboys all drink in the top pub. The top pub is a well-maintained traditional and stone country pub, and is quite popular with the, let's call them the town's, relatively elegant drinkers. The bottom pub, on the other hand, is an older timber-only, heritage-listed building, and it's usually not kept in good condition. That's where the footballers drink, cheap drinks, much rougher crowd. And one year, a couple of the footballers decide to exit the bottom pub, saunter across the town park, enter the top pub, and loudly declare anyone who wears a 10-gallon hat, takes it up they promptly got their own arses handed to them. So the next year the entire football team saunters across the park, and kicks the butt of everyone in the top pub. The third year, all the rodeo people went to the bottom pub and beat up everyone in there. The fourth year, both groups unexpectedly encountered each other in the middle of the park, halfway, years 5 and 6, well. Let's say the pub park brawl was starting to look like a tradition, and both groups brought extra people from out of town. Year 7, the local police called in extra officers from the nearby cities of Terry, Forster and Port Macquarie, and they were waiting with paddy wagons lockup vans for the two groups, who showed up and proceeded to fight with each other and the police. Took about 2 more years for the police to finally stamp it out, and the 9th and last year, they did it by preemptively arresting as many of the footballers as they could, in a massive drink-driving sting a week before the rodeo, and threatening the rodeo people the instant they arrived in town with severe prison time if they so much as blinked at the bottom pub. So yeah, my hometown. Story 14, location central. CT population approximate 3,200. Date 1224213. Event annual Christmas Eve party at the Smith's farm. Whole town goes for eggnog, bluegrass, guns, bonfires, etc. This one kid, we'll call him Simon, had a few too many. To paint a picture, this was the friend group that was always there from preschool on up through high school. In a small town it's hard to grow out of those kind of friend groups. Anyway, Simon was hammers telling us how he was head over heels in lovey with a farmer daughter. Yes, really, well, call her Angela. Party goes into the early morning, with most of the guests leaving around 12 a.m. Simon stuck around for a bit, then said he was going to walk home. He didn't live far. It was winter in New England, he would be fine. Turns out good old Simon walked to the farmer's house and tried calling out to Angela, tossing snowballs at her window until one of them inevitably smashed a bedroom window. Angela freaks out and calls the cops for a suspected burglary. While all this is taking place, I decide it's about time for me to be hitting the road as well. Maybe 1:30 a.m. I get into my car, start driving, and then I see Simon walking down the road towards his house. Puzzled, I pull over and yell over to him, "Dude, can you walk? Get in ya. It'll drive you home." We get not 5 miles from the farm and am met with 2 state troopers, blue and reds, guns drawn. Officer approaches the window, second officer approaches, one on my side, one on Simon's. Officer asks me, "Son, have you been drinking tonight?" Me, "No sir, just heading home." Simon screaming, "Yes officer, we're both drunk." Me, SMH officer, "Any drugs or firearms in the vehicle?" Boys, before I can answer Simon, "I don't have any drugs." But he might, you should ask him." Points at me. Keep in mind, Simon is very close to blacking out at this point, but he's forming sentences, so it's making the troopers extremely nervous. So they pull us both out of the car. While I'm trying to explain I have no idea about what Simon did or where he came from, I just picked him up. Trying to be a good friend, Simon just starts yelling the truth. They need to know the truth. The truth, they need to know the truth. At the same time the farmer pulls up, sees me and Simon. He asks the cop what's going on. The cops explain that we were stopped on suspicion of burglary at his house. Thank God the farmer vogues for us, claiming it all to be a mistake, and we were set free. The local bar used to chant the truth whenever Simon walks in. He showed up to the same reception this past Christmas. Good times. Story 15, a former coworker of mine spiraled out of control after the restaurant closed, became a heroin manufacturer, and was on FBI most wanted list. Anyway, so one day him and like 2 guys went around and broke into over 15 houses stealing money and guns until he broke into a house, and there was a 16-year-old girl, and they kidnapped her and held her hostage. Police from all 3 surrounding towns, sheriffs, highway patrol, and SWAT engaged in a multi-hour standoff and a brief exchange of gunfire. I don't remember how they ended up getting him. It was a huge news story for months, then it slowly got quiet. Nobody talks about it, but everyone remembers it. Story 16, there was a very large mentally disabled man who would spend all day every day sitting on the steps in front of a store. I asked about him once as a kid, and my father told me he was waiting for his mother to be done. She ran the store. I was surprised because they looked very similar in age. Turns out the woman was raped and impregnated by her father when she was 12. It was one of those things we weren't supposed to talk about. Just pretend it's all normal. Story 17, there was a secret gay population in our small town. The dentist had a secret apartment near his office. His wife and my mother were great friends. Not a word was spoken about it. Story 18, high school kids giving and receiving blowjobs on the back of a bus during a drive to a marching band competition, and none of them got into trouble. I'm a parent who was supervising on one of the buses. I assumed they'd be kicked out of band, but no, they were on the drumline and too important to be kicked out. It was bad. Story 19, the farmer who was a pedophile on boys, particularly the sons of migrant farm workers. Word got out after he died in his 60s, but no names of his local victims were mentioned. His family, wife, daughter apparently didn't know about it, and no one talked about it so that his family wouldn't be tainted by what he had done. Story 20. The hobby magician who killed his wife, disemboweled her in the bathtub, cut her head off and put it into a plastic bag and fled to Uppsala, Sweden. Stupidly, he had apparently raved about Uppsala, so the police checked for him there first. Wild but true story in a village of 2,000 inhabitants in Switzerland. Story 21. When I was a kid in middle school on the bus ride, there would be some racist white kids who talked about all the black peel at the bottom of a lake we'd drive by. I lived in a place well known for its KKK history. One year my mom tried to invite a black friend from work to our house, and she said, "Oh no, we don't go to that town after sundown." No ma'am. Flash forward to 2018, I think, and the city finally acknowledges formally that it had been involved in the largest race riot on voting day in the history of our country. I was a full-blown married adult and had no clue the full extent of that day, even though kids had always whispered about it. They dedicated a plaque for it and said they had learned. It's become more diverse, but the current mayor today is married to the 1920 sheriff's granddaughter who was in charge during the race riot and participated in it. Ocoee massacre. Since November, the number of Confederate flags that had at one time dwindled in my childhood neighborhood have once again started growing. Insanely sad. Edit words. Story 22. My town is 33,000, but this guy I went to school with died at the age of 18 from choking while high on opioids. A year later his father committed suicide. Several years later the older brother committed suicide. An extremely depressing story that a lot of locals know about but don't talk about. I asked my friends about it recently to see if they remembered. Story 23. A guy I went from pre-K through 12th with killed his GF and hid her body. She was going to out him for having with his male best friend in a small Texas town. Story 24. When I was a kid there was the story about the girl who killed her parents with scissors. I didn't take much stock into it because kids tell scary stories. When in high school the social studies teacher told us about it, she was being molested by her father and the mother knew. She murdered them in their sleep with a pair of shears. She then drugged the bodies into the garage and tried to burn them, but all she had was perfume. Then she went to the neighbors and made up a story that fell apart really quickly. The FBI agent showed up without a camera, and the only person in the county with a decent camera was my teacher. It was so cold that his camera froze up, so the sheriff had him fake taking pictures while the agents were there. Then they had to go back again and take the real evidence pictures. One time my mom pointed out the vacant lot where the house used to be. A few years ago I asked her about it and put the story on Reddit. I researched her and found out she had been taken to the state mental hospital. She was found innocent by temporary insanity. However, she had been raped in a hospital and had a child. She lives a few miles away and has a Facebook account, but I have never tried to contact her. Her niece found the post on Reddit and contacted me a few years ago. Her mother was away in college, denies the molestation story and said it was because of drugs. Drugs beyond ditchweed would have been nearly impossible to get in our tiny town back then. Story 25. A local woman had enough of her husband's abuse and was going to leave him for California. He picked up his two kids, early 7 and 9, and had them wait for her, shot both kids in front of her, then shot her, called 911 and told them what he did and committed suicide on the phone. Lady was a big part of the Shriners and Eastern Star, and husband was a Mason. Sweetest lady and the best kids, super smart. Owlies found her husband never wanted to be at the hospital. Her when she was sick had a autoimmune thing. Story 26. Guy shot his wife in his neighbor's driveway, then shot himself while teenage granddaughter, I was only a year older than her, was on 911 call. News played that call on TV and I was so pissed and sad for her. Grandma was a nice lady. Grandpa had some psychiatric issues and I didn't really know him. Story 27. Local barber that all the police and most men went to also made and sold child. He was finally arrested for it but had clearly been making and selling it for years, if not decades. I'm not naming names or town because I know some of the victims and want to keep their struggles private. And I'm not talking barely legal teens. We're talking like 5-year-olds. Story 28. A chiropractor from the next town over used to dress like Elvis. He killed a 15-year-old girl from our town in 1978 and burned down a barn with her body in it. Everyone knows he did it. For 10 years after, he used to sit outside the city pool and watch the teenage girls in their swimsuits. Nobody said to him. Her murder is a cold case that got very little attention in our small town. Story 29. This woman killed my friend's dad, chopped him up and burnt his body in a bonfire out the back. I can't remember what happened, but she didn't go to jail and walked around town all the time. Everyone was scared of her. I think there were like 3,000 people in my town and that was the only murder like ever. Rural East Coast, Australia. Story 30. The murder. This man murdered his wife, threw her out of the second-floor window, put her body in the family van, took his kids to daycare, told the daycare his wife was missing, went to the car wash, washed the blood out of the van, dumped the body, then called the cops and said wife was missing. Story 31. A kid in my grade was the son of the circuit court judge. Throughout the duration of my high school years, there were several suicides in this small town amongst the student population, enough to really be atypical of such a small community. Then they mysteriously stopped, and in the last 30 years, there haven't been any. Rumor is that the judge's kid was a murderer and knew he could get away with pretty much anything. Details were always sketchy. I'm glad I was on his good side. Story 32. A guy killed his son for the insurance money, put a truck up on a jack and then dropped it on his kid and went to a party while he died. After that happened, it came out that he had killed his wife for insurance money out in California. He boarded up some windows to do work on the house, locked her in the bathroom, and set fire to the house. Story 33 My middle school football coach who hated me and him got charged with sodomy of 3 kids and other acts of molestation to a bunch of others. We had a team party at his house and he had this room with extra bunk beds and video game consoles that were way out of the age range for his 2 toddler sons. He told a group of the popular kids that they should come sleep over sometime. I saw the signs of that being creepy and weird. I even made jokes like, what is this, an after-school special? And should we call McGroff the crime dog to closer friends about the odd party? His assistant coach was even a cop who I also hated. After it all came out, no one talked about it because the kids he was molesting were the popular bully kids with rich parents. I just looked him up. He spent 15 years in prison and is out now. He was a super groomer. It seems he volunteered to coach football and baseball to be close to kids. Story 34 My high school ROTC teacher who was a senior master sergeant in the Air Force, well loved by everyone, and one of the best teachers, so we thought, got caught sleeping with an underage student. Nothing happened outside of him just not being allowed back to teach. No charges against him, nada. He was extremely wealthy, even for a teacher, because of his family's generational wealth, so everyone knows he paid it off. The girl never showed back up to school either and apparently moved away. Story 35 Pleasant Grove, Utah, April 13, 2014 Darren West began cleaning out the garage of the home he once shared with his wife, Megan Huntsman. Nothing could have prepared him for what he would uncover. Inside a small white box, wrapped in plastic, was the tiny, decaying body of an infant. West immediately called the police. They searched the home and found 6 more dead infants, all in boxes, stashed away in the garage. After questioning, Huntsman admitted to killing the infants between 1996 and 2006. One was stillborn. As confirmed at autopsy, she was heavily addicted to meth and alcohol at the time, and said she killed them because she couldn't afford to raise them. Apparently bearing, birthing and killing multiple children was easier than using birth control. This shut our childhood town down. Cops quit from the trauma, the extended family was a mess, and the cherry on top was she gave birth to 3 girls she kept. The infant deaths were woven between the daughters she kept. So gnarly, but no one talks about it anymore. It became the town's shame. Story 36 There was a cop who was babysitting his girlfriend's baby and shook it to death when it wouldn't stop crying. There were a couple of best friends who were kind of rivals and one accidentally shot the other one while showing him his gun. Story 37 Back in the 80s, had 2 married couples who played cards together every week. Suddenly both couples got divorced, then remarried the other's partner. They kept playing cards every week. Source knew their kids. Story 38 Older woman retires. Maybe around 70-ish, would go to the laundromat every so often and hand out rolls of quarters. Just a way she paid it forward. She found naked, brutally raped, and murdered on a wooded walking path near the river, not far from downtown. Story 39 When SN told her boyfriend she was pregnant on Easter, and he said it wasn't his, so she went to go kill herself by laying on the train tracks, but it only amputated one leg above the knee and the other a few inches higher. Story 40 A little girl was raped and murdered. I'm sure it was talked about at the time. The school cafeteria is named after her, but it's one of those things no one wants to talk about. Similarly, the grade school principal's son committed suicide his junior or senior year of high school. Now that the principal has also passed, I imagine the story is less relevant. Story 41 Fatal hunting accident with a school kid in a village with a pop of 5,000. A dad and his son took the boat out to hunt birds with a 2-round rifle. Dad sitting in the back, kid in front. Dad fires the first shoot, and just before firing the second round the kid jumps up to see if the got hit. Hit right in the back of the head, was instant. Couldn't stop thinking about what the father experienced while rowing back for a while. This was before cell phones as well. I was his classmate. Not close, but we hang out sometimes. A skater kid with hair. The school and community came together and held talks with us kids, so that was a light during that time. Now it's decades ago, so I don't think it counts as a common story, but I don't live there anymore, so can't say. Story 42 After so many years of trying, we finally got a brand new fire station. A few years later they were preparing dinner when a call came in. They hustled out to the scene and took care of it. After they were done another call came in. Whoever was preparing dinner left the stove on and it eventually caught the kitchen on fire, so they rushed back to their station to put out that fire. I don't remember how long it took to repair the damage. No one really talks about that anymore. Story 43 One high school math teacher's husband committed suicide a few years ago, and she recently had a bad health scare. Most students' attentive parents know, she is the sweetest woman ever and deserves the world. She is incredibly strong and seems very happy. No, although I know her life must be difficult some days. Story 44 Minor teen girl had a much older adult boyfriend and he convinced her to kill her whole family. It was big news when it happened and now it's just a quirky history fact. Story 45 Criminal sadistic obstetrician in one of our neighboring towns. There was a court case, but it was all hushed up for some reason. Since then there have been scandals about criminal sadistic healthcare workers in the psych ward there, and also the bad level of healthcare generally. People always tell you go north when you're talking about what hospital you might go to. Story 46 had a very prominent figure found in their car from overdose officially. Unofficially it was a concoction of a number of hard drugs, and the car was filled with a number of different dildos and toys. It is so unbelievable that the very few people who do know the actual story assume it must have been an inside job hit. Can't really get into much detail. Story 47 Rohnert Park, CA. A police officer shot and killed Kwon Chung Kao, an engineer, outside his house in 1997 after he had gotten a promotion at work. The person who lives in that house today is actually the person who bought it from his wife a year after the murder. The cop ended up facing no disciplinary action, ended up retiring and moving to Texas where he became the mayor of a small town. Fortunately, he's dead now. Story 48. Not really a small town but a small corner of a big town. At my high school, about 30 years before I attended, a married teacher moved in one of his students to be a live-in nanny at his house because she had a rough home life. There were rumors that the student and teacher were having an affair. Then one day the guy's wife goes missing. There was an initial investigation but it was kind of swept under the rug because the guy was friends with all the local cops and he was kind of a big guy around town. People pretty much stopped talking about it until a couple of years ago when a podcast was released that really went into the case. The podcast kind of forced the police to reopen the case and the guy was eventually arrested, charged and sentenced to his wife's murder even though her body has never been found. Went to that school for 4 years and never heard about until the podcast. Story 49. The vanishing of the family from Comerang House, a property in regional Australia. When the town learned that the family was suddenly missing, the pilfering began. The first local thieves noticed food on plates, unfinished. My family ended up with a giant mirror in the gold leaf frame. Then another family member took it and I don't know where it is now. I think Mum does. No one talks about the mirror or the missing family. Creepy, huh? Story 50. In the small town I grew up in, there was a story going around that a prominent local businessman had a rather unfortunate encounter with a carrot, as in, the carrot became stuck in a certain part of his body, and he had to seek medical attention. What made it particularly funny was that the guy had brightest tuft of orange hair atop his head. We called him Carrot. Whenever you'd see him around town, there'd almost always been some muffled chuckles happening in the background. Story 51. About 8 years ago, the house I am renting was used as a place for growing weed. This is illegal in our country. They had every room equipped with equipment and saplings. A couple of weeks before the saplings were ready, something in the house caught fire, and they got busted. If people ask where I live, I just say the weed house and everybody knows. Story 52. A bunch of band kids stole from Disney World on their trip to Florida, but it's been hushed up by the school district. No transparency, let alone consequences, and gets hushed up if anyone even tries to talk about it. Story 53. People not talking in a small town. There's no such thing. There is nothing off limits, especially in a small town. It's the worst place to be if you've got something you don't want anybody to know about to talk. Story 54. The local prosecutor got banned from walking around the police department without an. Nobody really knows why this suddenly became a new policy, but most people assume that the prosecutor was stealing coke from the evidence locker. Story 55. Pastor's wife was messing around with a recent graduate who was coaching their kids' football team. Pastor, very godly man, threatened to murk him if he didn't leave town. He came back a couple of years ago after he turned 21. I haven't heard anything since or any drama, but he's still preaching and owns a large company. They're still together, everyone knows. Nobody talks about it. Story 56. Nobody in Blue Ridge, Georgia talks about how many people go missing up here never to be seen again. We're right next to the Cohuta Wilderness, a massive plot of federal land that is very wild and undeveloped. It is creepy camping up there. Story 57. The UFO guy who got people together to build a saucer-shaped craft in a pole barn that was supposed to be towed out onto Lake Huron and picked up by a mothership. The leader wrote a book called The Intelligence of the Universe Speaks 1974. The craft was built but never completed. People lost interest. I saw it when the land went up for sale. Story 58. A girl was gang raped after they rear-ended her car to target her and her friend. Her friend ran off into the forest and was lost until sunrise while she was driven to another location, threatened and dropped off. It was so insane the FBI actually came, which for where I'm from is a massive deal, and caught every person involved. Truly it was a stain on our community when it happened, and I think everyone was relieved they were caught. Everybody wanted to forget that. Story 59. I was born in a town that had a story of a dude climbing up into the water tower and drowning to commit suicide. He was up there for quite some time until the townsfolk complained about the water. By the time they located him, it was partially decomposed and bones. The joke is we got good water. It has a lot of body in it. Thankfully I was born a few years after it happened. Hopefully it was cleaned out by then. Story 60. 10-year-old boy gets out of the house and runs to a neighbor for help. Him and his siblings were being severely neglected and abused. 4 children were rescued. The house was in squalor, garbage and feces everywhere. The kids were emaciated. Upon further police investigation, 3 dead infants were found in the house as well. One, still attached to the placenta, was found stuffed in a backpack. The other 2 were skeletons and still had diapers and clothes on. The family's pet dog was found dead as well, presumably from starvation. Blackstone House of Horrors for anyone who wants to know more. It's a really sad case. Apparently the mother was trying to hide the children from her boyfriend that did not want any more kids. They tore the house down, but I drive by the lot frequently and always feel sad for those babies. Story 61. High school gym teacher was fired for having an inappropriate relationship with a student. Destroys her family, etc. Her replacement is also later fired for having inappropriate relationships with multiple students, destroys her family, etc. The replacement ends up reigniting the scandal when she gets remarried a few years later, to the now graduated student that had an inappropriate relationship with the first gym teacher. Story 62. I'm from a small town of around 5K, in the late 80s. A man killed 6 of his family members and himself with a shotgun at his parents' home during a holiday. There was also a woman who was raped and burned to death after she tried to give the local drunk a ride home. Lots of up in that community for sure. Story 63. Sometimes women who had been heavily abused would say he had been lost in Bering or died at sea. Then they would throw a massive party. I was really young at the time, but even then it seemed a little bit too jubilant to be a funeral. Looking back on it now, I still don't know if they hid the bodies somewhere in the forest, put them in the tide for the crabs to eat, or if those men really died off a boat somewhere in the icy North Sea. No one talks about it, and when I asked about the men who died fishing, I'm too young to know. Okay. Story 64. The time the son of the wealthiest man in town almost hit a kid with his sports car that he was driving high and drunk. Literally, the kid turned to look at a friend while crossing the road with the bus right there and was just missed by the idiot by inches. The dad took away his son's car after that. Boy got lucky since the kid was crossing the road legally and he was going 90 in a 25. Story 65. There are actually a few. One is that there was a guy who had a mental break, no one knows why, but he was running barefoot through the streets with a kitchen knife, and ended up taking his own life with it when confronted by police. This was only a year or two, I don't recall exactly, after his little brother died accidentally. Too legit accident. He slipped and fell over the side of the canal after drinking at a bar that was right along it. Devastating. I know the older brother had a drug problem too, but I think everything just became too much. I knew the family well. They lived in my neighborhood. It was like the story vanished as soon as it happened. Story 66. The time an heir to a huge fortune from a now 150-year-old major brewery ran his sports car off a notorious curve in my hometown, killing his girlfriend and being arrested for DUI. He was never charged as he and his insurance paid off the girl's family, and by threatening to sue the county for multi-million dollars for knowing that the curve, called Deadman's Curve, was unsafe, was never charged. He later took over his family's company and was even featured in some of their commercials before selling it to a multinational more than a decade ago. Story 67. Everyone talked about the incident but keep their opinion about the trial outcome close to the chest, so I'm still sharing. The town I grew up in isn't super tiny but has only had like 2 murders in the past 30 years. A beloved teacher was kidnapped and beaten. She survived but shortly after died from falling down the stairs. Her husband was acquitted of murder, but everyone I've ever talked to still thinks he did it. He died several years later, weirdly enough, after falling from his roof.